care about is that we at least attempt to prosecute those who committed serious crimes with Epstein, especially regarding heinous exploitation of underage girls. This is absolutely based. I am so happy to see this.
And most terrible gift that humans possess, and it is the visitor's vision over the vision of Christ. Part 10. The birth of existentialism and the divided self. Long before existentialism became a recognized philosophical movement, Dostoevsky had identified and dramatized its central insights. Through characters like the underground man, Raskolnikov, and Ivan Karamazov, he explored themes that would later become the foundation of existentialist thought: the absurdity of existence, the burden of freedom, the anxiety of choice, and the search for authentic selfhood in a meaningless universe. But Dostoevsky's existentialism was different from the secular existentialism that would emerge in the 20th century, because it was grounded in a profound spiritual struggle rather than a rejection of all spiritual possibilities. For Dostoevsky, the confrontation with meaninglessness was not the end of the philosophical journey, but the beginning of a deeper search for transcendent meaning. The underground man represents the first fully developed existentialist hero in literature. He is acutely aware that his existence precedes any essence or meaning that he might try to impose upon it. He knows that he is radically free to choose who he wants to be, but he also knows that this freedom is a terrible burden that most people try to escape. He understands that all human values and institutions are human constructions rather than objective features of reality. He recognizes that reason cannot provide ultimate guidance for human action, because reason itself is just another human tool with no transcendent authority. These insights anticipate the central themes of existentialist philosophy by several decades. But the underground man's response to these insights is profoundly different from that of later existentialist thinkers. Instead of embracing his freedom and creating his own values, he becomes paralyzed by the recognition of his radical responsibility for his choices. Instead of affirming life despite its apparent meaninglessness, he retreats into bitter isolation and self-destructive behavior. Instead of finding authenticity through the acceptance of anxiety and uncertainty, he becomes consumed by resentment and spite. The underground man shows us what happens when existentialist insights are divorced from any spiritual or transcendent framework that could give them positive meaning. Without God, or some other source of objective value, existential freedom becomes a curse rather than a blessing. Dostoevsky's exploration of the divided self was equally prophetic and influential. His characters are not unified personalities, but complex battlegrounds where conflicting impulses, beliefs and desires struggle for dominance. Raskolnikov contains both a potential saint and a potential criminal, and his actions emerge from the temporary victory of one aspect of his personality over others. Ivan Karamazov is simultaneously a believer and an atheist, capable of profound religious insight and equally profound religious rebellion. The underground man is both a penetrating social critic and a pathetic failure who cannot apply his insights to his own life. These characters anticipate the modern psychological understanding of personality as multiple and contradictory rather than single and coherent. This division of the self creates what existentialists would later call authenticity problems. If we contain multiple conflicting selves, which one represents our true identity? If our conscious thoughts and stated values conflict with our unconscious drives and actual behavior, which should we trust? If we can observe ourselves thinking and feeling, who is the observer and who is the observed? These questions torment Dostoevsky's characters and drive them to increasingly desperate attempts to achieve some kind of unified selfhood. But their efforts usually fail because the division is built into the structure of human consciousness itself. Dostoevsky understood that this divided consciousness was both a burden and an opportunity. The same self-awareness that makes authentic action difficult also makes moral growth possible. The same capacity for self-observation that creates anxiety and paralysis also enables genuine self-knowledge and repentance. The same freedom that allows people to choose evil also allows them to choose good. The divided self is the price we pay for being human. But it is also what makes genuine humanity possible. Without the capacity to step outside ourselves and observe our own thoughts and actions, we would be no different from animals acting on instinct. The existential themes in Dostoevsky's work also include a profound exploration of what would later be called bad faith, the tendency to deny one's freedom and responsibility by pretending to be determined by external forces. Many of his characters try to escape the burden of choice by convincing themselves that their actions are determined by their social circumstances, their psychological makeup, or their philosophical beliefs. Raskolnikov claims that his murder was justified by his theory about extraordinary individuals, but this is really an attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his free choice to kill. The underground man blames his problems on social conditions and psychological determinism, but this is really an excuse for his refusal to take positive action to improve his life. These characters demonstrate how easy it is to use sophisticated intellectual analysis as a way of avoiding genuine moral responsibility. But Dostoevsky also shows us characters who achieve what existentialists would call authentic existence by fully accepting their freedom and responsibility. Alyosha Karamazov does not try to escape the burden of choice by appealing to external authorities or deterministic explanations. He takes full responsibility for his actions and their consequences while remaining open to grace and guidance from beyond himself. Sonia Marmeladova in Crime and Punishment freely chooses to sacrifice herself for her family while maintaining her dignity and moral integrity. These characters show that authenticity is possible, but it requires enormous courage and spiritual strength. It cannot be achieved through intellectual analysis alone, but requires a fundamental transformation of one's relationship to existence itself. The existential dimension of Dostoevsky's work is most clearly visible in his treatment of death and mortality. His characters are constantly aware that they will die, and that this fact renders all their projects and concerns ultimately meaningless from a cosmic perspective. This awareness of mortality creates both anxiety and urgency. If life is short and death is certain, then every choice matters enormously because there may not be opportunities to correct mistakes or try alternative paths. But if death makes everything meaningless, then no choice matters at all, because all outcomes lead to the same ultimate destination. This paradox creates the existential tension that drives much of the psychological drama in Dostoevsky's novels. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot embodies a unique response to this existential situation. His epilepsy gives him direct experience of what he believes to be the eternal moment that exists beyond time and death. This experience allows him to live with complete presence and authenticity because he has seen that temporal existence is not the only reality. But his knowledge also makes him unable to function effectively in ordinary social reality because he cannot take seriously the things that most people consider important. Mishkin represents both the possibility and the cost of transcending the normal existential predicament. His authenticity comes at the price of practical effectiveness and ordinary human happiness. Dostoevsky's influence on later existentialist thinkers was enormous, though often unacknowledged. Kierkegaard, who is usually considered the father of existentialism, was deeply influenced by Dostoevsky's exploration of anxiety, despair, and the leap of faith. Nietzsche's concept of the overman and his critique of conventional morality owe much to characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. Sartre's analysis of bad faith and the burden of freedom clearly draws on insights that Dostoevsky dramatized decades earlier. Camus' treatment of the absurd and the rebel shows the influence of characters like the underground man and Ivan Karamazov. Even Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence and being toward death reflects themes that Dostoevsky explored in psychological rather than philosophical terms. But Dostoevsky's existentialism differed fundamentally from most later versions because it remained open to religious and spiritual possibilities. While 20th century existentialists typically assumed that God was dead and that humans had to create meaning entirely through their own efforts, Dostoevsky saw the confrontation with meaninglessness as a necessary step toward authentic religious faith. His characters who achieve genuine authenticity do so not by rejecting all transcendent possibilities, but by moving through despair to a deeper level of spiritual understanding. For Dostoevsky, existential honesty about the human condition was not incompatible with religious faith, but actually required such faith to avoid falling into nihilistic despair. This religious dimension of his existentialism makes his work more hopeful and ultimately more humane than much of the existentialist literature that followed.
Finally, mission is done.
Psychology
Yes,
of the
yes, yes, yes,
unconscious
yes,
and
yes.
Human motivation. Decades before Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis, Dostoevsky had already mapped the unconscious territories of the human mind with unprecedented precision and insight. His novels function as case studies in psychological analysis, revealing the hidden drives, repressed desires, and unconscious conflicts that motivate human behavior. Freud himself acknowledged this
Samo
depth,
prva klasa.
ranking
Bog to ma za šta treba za
Dostoevsky
masteri. onda.
second only to Shakespeare in literary achievement, and declaring that the Russian novelist had anticipated many of the central discoveries of psychoanalytic theory. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights went beyond anything that academic psychology would achieve because they were grounded in direct observation of human nature under extreme conditions rather than theoretical speculation. Dostoevsky understood that human beings are driven by forces that operate below the level of conscious awareness. People rarely act for the reasons they claim to act, and they often pursue goals that directly contradict their stated values and rational interests. Raskolnikov tells himself that he commits murder to help the poor and test his theory about extraordinary individuals, but the real motivation is his need to assert power and overcome his sense of personal inadequacy. The underground man claims that he withdraws from society because other people are inferior and unworthy of his attention, but the real reason is his terror of rejection and his inability to risk genuine human connection. Ivan Karamazov develops elaborate philosophical arguments against God's existence, but his atheism is really driven by his emotional inability to accept a world in which innocent children suffer. In each case, the conscious explanation serves to hide rather than reveal the true psychological dynamics at work. This insight into the divided nature of human motivation was revolutionary in its implications. If people do not understand their own motivations, then rational arguments and moral exhortations are largely useless for changing behavior. If unconscious drives are more powerful than conscious intentions, then social reform efforts that appeal only to reason and self-interest are doomed to failure. If psychological conflicts operate outside the realm of voluntary control, then traditional approaches to criminal justice and moral education need to be fundamentally reconsidered. Dostoevsky's psychological realism challenged every assumption about human nature that was common in his time, and continues to challenge many assumptions that are common today. Dostoevsky was particularly brilliant in his analysis of what psychologists would later call defense mechanisms, the unconscious strategies that people use to protect themselves from painful truths about their own nature and circumstances. Rationalization allows people to create logical explanations for behavior that is actually driven by irrational emotional needs. Projection allows people to attribute their own unacceptable impulses to others rather than acknowledging them in themselves. Denial allows people to refuse to see obvious realities that would force them to change their self-image or behavior. Compensation allows people to excel in one area as a way of making up for felt inadequacies in another area. Sublimation allows people to channel antisocial impulses into socially acceptable activities. Dostoevsky's characters demonstrate all of these mechanisms with psychological accuracy that would not be matched by academic psychology for decades. The underground man is perhaps the most psychologically complex character in all of literature because he is simultaneously the subject and object of psychological analysis. He understands his own defense mechanisms perfectly well, but this understanding does not free him from them. He knows that his resentment is irrational, his social philosophy is self-serving, and his isolation is self-imposed. But knowing these things only makes his problems worse rather than better. He becomes trapped in endless layers of self-consciousness, analyzing his analysis of his analysis until he can no longer distinguish between genuine insight and psychological manipulation. This represents a profound discovery about the limits of psychological self-awareness as a therapeutic tool. Simply understanding your problems does not automatically solve them, and excessive self-analysis can become a new form of psychological pathology. Dostoevsky also anticipated many insights about the relationship between psychological trauma and adult behavior patterns. Many of his characters have experienced childhood abuse, abandonment, or other forms of early trauma that continue to influence their adult relationships and life choices. Smerdyakov's murderous hatred stems partly from his experience of being an illegitimate child who was never fully accepted by his father or his social environment. Nastasia Filipovna's self-destructive behavior in The Idiot reflects her psychological devastation from childhood sexual abuse. The underground man's social anxiety and resentment can be traced to early experiences of humiliation and rejection. But Dostoevsky never presents trauma as a complete explanation for adult behavior because that would eliminate moral responsibility and the possibility of redemption. Trauma influences but does not determine adult choices, and people retain the capacity to transcend their psychological conditioning through spiritual transformation. One of Dostoevsky's most important psychological insights concerns the role of guilt and conscience in human motivation. Many of his characters are driven by unconscious guilt about real or imagined wrongdoing, and this guilt manifests itself in various forms of self-punishment and self-sabotage. Raskolnikov's illness and eventual confession result from his psychological inability to live with the guilt of murder, even though he consciously believes that his action was justified. The underground man's self-isolation and misery represent a form of self-imposed punishment for his perceived moral and social failures. Ivan Karamazov's mental breakdown reflects his unconscious sense of responsibility for his father's murder, even though he did not directly participate in the crime. These characters demonstrate that conscience operates as an autonomous psychological force that cannot be eliminated through rational argument or philosophical sophistication. But Dostoevsky also understood that guilt could be pathological and destructive rather than morally beneficial. Excessive guilt can lead to psychological paralysis, self-hatred, and the inability to accept forgiveness and redemption. Some of his characters become so consumed by guilt that they lose the capacity for positive action and healthy relationships. They become addicted to suffering as a way of appeasing their punitive superego, but this suffering does not lead to genuine moral improvement or spiritual growth. True redemption requires not the elimination of guilt, but its transformation through grace and genuine repentance. This insight anticipates modern therapeutic approaches that distinguish between healthy guilt that promotes moral behavior and neurotic guilt that inhibits psychological functioning. Dostoevsky's analysis of love and sexuality was equally profound and ahead of its time. He understood that romantic love often involves psychological projection, wish fulfillment, and the attempt to use another person to solve one's own internal conflicts. Characters like Nastasia Filipovna and Grushenka are loved not for who they really are, but for what they represent in the psychological economy of their admirers. Prince Mishkin's love for Nastasia is partly motivated by his need to save someone as a way of giving meaning to his own suffering. Dmitry Karamazov's passion for Grushenka reflects his unconscious search for maternal acceptance and approval. These relationships are psychologically complex rather than simply romantic because they involve the intersection of multiple unconscious needs and conflicts. Dostoevsky also anticipated insights about the psychology of power and dominance that would later be developed by thinkers like Nietzsche and Adler. Many of his characters are motivated by what psychologists would call the will to power, the need to assert control over their environment and other people as a way of compensating for feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability. Raskolnikov's theory about extraordinary individuals is really a rationalization for his psychological need to feel superior to ordinary people. The underground man's intellectual sophistication serves partly as a weapon for asserting dominance over those he considers less insightful than himself. Ivan Karamazov's atheistic philosophy functions partly as a way of asserting his independence from divine authority. These characters show how intellectual and spiritual pursuits can be corrupted by unconscious power drives that operate beneath the surface of conscious motivation. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most profound psychological insight concerns the relationship between suffering and psychological development. He understood that people often unconsciously seek out suffering because it serves important psychological functions that pleasure and happiness cannot provide. Suffering can validate one's sense of being special or different from others. It can provide a sense of meaning and purpose for those who feel that their lives are otherwise insignificant. It can serve as a form of self-punishment that appeases guilt and provides relief from psychological tension. It can create bonds of sympathy and connection with others who have also suffered. And it can serve as a catalyst for spiritual growth and transformation that would not occur under comfortable circumstances. This understanding of suffering as psychologically functional rather than simply pathological was far ahead of its time and remains controversial even today. Dostoevsky's psychological insights were not merely theoretical, but practical and therapeutic. His novels function as a form of psychological healing for readers who recognize their own conflicts and struggles in his characters. By seeing their problems dramatized with honesty and compassion, readers can begin to understand and accept aspects of themselves that they might otherwise deny or repress. By witnessing characters who achieve redemption and transformation despite their psychological wounds, readers can maintain hope for their own healing and growth. Dostoevsky's work provides what psychologists would later call corrective emotional experiences that can help people move beyond destructive patterns and achieve greater psychological integration. This therapeutic dimension of his writing helps explain why his novels continue to have such a powerful impact on readers more than a century after they were written. Part 12, The Rejection of Western Civilization and the Return to Soil. Dostoevsky believed that Western European civilization was leading humanity towards spiritual catastrophe, and that Russia's salvation lay in rejecting Western ideas and returning to its own native spiritual and cultural roots. This was not mere nationalist prejudice, but a carefully developed philosophical position based on his analysis of what he saw as the fundamental errors of Western thought and their inevitable consequences. Western civilization, he argued, had chosen the path of rational materialism, individual autonomy and technological progress at the expense of spiritual depth, communal solidarity and transcendent meaning. This choice had produced societies that were materially prosperous but spiritually empty, technically advanced but morally confused, and individually free but collectively fragmented. Russia could avoid this fate only by consciously choosing a different path based on Orthodox Christianity, traditional peasant values, and what he called a return to the soil. Dostoevsky's critique of Western civilization was comprehensive and devastating. He saw Western Christianity as having been corrupted by its alliance with political power and its embrace of rational theology. Both Catholicism and Protestantism had lost the mystical and contemplative dimensions of authentic Christianity in their pursuit of worldly influence and intellectual respectability. Western philosophy had abandoned the search for ultimate truth in favor of skeptical analysis and scientific reduction. Western politics had replaced traditional authority and organic community with artificial contracts and mechanical institutions. Western economics had reduced human relationships to market transactions and transformed everything into a commodity to be bought and sold. The result was a civilization that was technically impressive but spiritually bankrupt. The fundamental error of Western civilization, according to Dostoevsky, was its assumption that human reason could solve all problems and create perfect societies without reference to divine guidance or transcendent truth. This assumption had led Western thinkers to develop elaborate philosophical and political systems that ignored the mysterious and irrational aspects of human nature. They believed that people were essentially rational creatures who would naturally choose their own best interests if given proper education and favorable social conditions. They thought that social institutions could be designed according to rational principles that would eliminate conflict and create universal happiness. They assumed that scientific progress would eventually answer all important questions and solve all significant problems. These beliefs seemed reasonable and progressive, but Dostoevsky saw them as dangerous delusions that would lead to unprecedented tyranny and spiritual destruction. The alternative that Dostoevsky proposed was what he called a return to the soil, a conscious embrace of traditional Russian values and ways of life that had been preserved by the peasantry, despite centuries of westernizing influence from the educated classes. The soil represented not merely agriculture or rural life, but a whole constellation of spiritual and cultural values that were fundamentally different from Western individualism and rationalism. These values included sobernost, the mystical unity of the Orthodox Christian community, conciliarity, the practice of making decisions through spiritual consensus rather than rational debate, humility, the recognition that human wisdom is limited and that ultimate truth comes from God rather than human reason, and suffering love, the willingness to bear the pain of others as a path to spiritual growth and redemption. These values had been preserved in their purest form by the Russian peasantry, who had remained closer to the Orthodox Christian tradition than the westernized aristocracy and intelligentsia. Dostoevsky's idealization of the Russian peasantry was based partly on his own experience during his years of imprisonment in Siberia. He had expected the common criminals in the prison camp to be degraded and brutalized by their circumstances, but instead he found that many of them possessed a spiritual depth and moral sensitivity that was often lacking in educated society. They were capable of extraordinary acts of kindness and self-sacrifice despite their harsh living conditions. They maintained their religious faith despite having every reason to despair. They preserved traditional values of family loyalty, personal honor, and community solidarity that had been weakened or abandoned by Western-influenced intellectuals. Most importantly, they had not lost their capacity for genuine repentance and spiritual transformation. Their suffering had made them more rather than less human, while the comfort and education of the upper classes had often made them more selfish and spiritually shallow. This experience convinced Dostoevsky that the Russian people possessed a unique spiritual wisdom that could save not only Russia but the entire world from the spiritual crisis of modernity. While Western civilization was moving toward materialism, atheism, and social fragmentation, Russia had preserved the authentic Christian understanding of human nature and social organization. Russian Orthodoxy maintained the mystical and contemplative traditions that Western Christianity had lost. Russian peasant culture preserved communal values and practices that Western individualism had destroyed. Russian literature and art expressed spiritual insights that Western rationalism could not comprehend. If Russia could resist the temptation to imitate Western models and instead develop according to its own spiritual principles, it could become a beacon of hope for all humanity. But Dostoevsky's vision of Russia's messianic mission was complicated by his recognition that Russian society was itself deeply corrupted by Western influences. The Russian aristocracy had been imitating Western European culture for generations and had lost touch with their own spiritual roots. Russian intellectuals were often more Western than the Westerners themselves, embracing radical ideologies that even European thinkers found extreme. Russian institutions were increasingly modeled on Western patterns rather than traditional Orthodox principles. Even the Russian Orthodox Church had been influenced by Western theological methods and had lost some of its original spiritual purity. The return to the soil could not be accomplished simply by rejecting foreign influences, but required a conscious spiritual renewal that would restore Russia's connection to its own deepest traditions. This spiritual renewal would require a fundamental transformation of Russian education, culture, and social organization. Instead of imitating Western universities and teaching Western philosophy, Russian educational institutions should focus on Orthodox theology, traditional Russian literature, and the practical wisdom of peasant culture. Instead of copying Western social and political institutions, Russia should develop forms of governance and social organization based on orthodox principles of soberness and conciliarity. Instead of pursuing Western models of economic development, Russia should create an economy based on mutual aid, communal ownership and spiritual rather than material values. This transformation would not be easy because it would require the educated classes to abandon their privileged position and learn from those they had traditionally considered their inferiors. But it was necessary if Russia was to fulfill its destiny as the spiritual leader of humanity. Dostoevsky believed that this spiritual mission was not merely a matter of cultural preference, but a cosmic necessity. The Western path of rationalism and materialism was leading humanity towards spiritual death and ultimate meaninglessness. If this process continued unchecked, human beings would lose their capacity for genuine love, faith, and moral responsibility. They would become sophisticated animals, pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, but incapable of transcending their biological nature. Science and technology would advance, but human beings would become less, rather than more human. Social organization would become more efficient, but individual souls would become more empty and degraded. The end result would be a form of civilization that was technically advanced but spiritually dead. Only a civilization based on orthodox Christian principles could reverse this process and restore humanity's connection to transcendent meaning and purpose. Such a civilization would not reject science and technology, but would subordinate them to spiritual goals rather than making them ends in themselves. It would not eliminate individual freedom, but would ground that freedom in spiritual rather than materialistic values. It would not destroy social progress, but would define progress in terms of spiritual development rather than material accumulation.
Ma idemo zauzeti bazu, ba preživjet će on, ali nećemo ganjati, ba nećemo trošiti bespotrebno.
Traditional wisdom and spiritual insight. This was Russia's mission, to show the world that it was possible to be both modern and spiritual, both technically competent and morally grounded.
Debilčine jedan, znači ne znaju šta rade.
But Dostoevsky also recognized that this mission might fail.
Neće da ga sačka.
Russia might succumb to Western influences and lose its unique spiritual character.
Ali ne moraju.
The Russian people might choose material comfort over spiritual depth, rational sophistication over mystical wisdom, individual autonomy over communal solidarity. If this happened, Russia would become just another Western country, and humanity would lose its last hope for spiritual renewal. The world would then proceed inexorably toward the spiritual catastrophe that Dostoevsky saw as the inevitable endpoint of Western civilization. The choice was stark. Either Russia would fulfill its messianic mission and save the world, or the world would be lost to materialism and spiritual death. This vision of Russia's role in world history was both inspiring and dangerous. It provided a sense of meaning and purpose that helped many Russians maintain their cultural identity in the face of Western pressure for modernization and westernization. But it also encouraged a form of nationalist arrogance that could be used to justify almost any action taken in the name of Russia's spiritual mission. If Russia was destined to save the world, then anything that served Russian interests could be presented as serving the interests of humanity itself. If Orthodox Christianity was the only authentic form of Christianity, then other forms of Christianity could be treated as heresies that deserved to be eliminated. If Russian culture was spiritually superior to Western culture, then Russians had the right and obligation to impose their values on other peoples for their own good. The same vision that could inspire genuine spiritual renewal could also justify imperialism, religious persecution, and cultural chauvinism. Part 13. the eternal struggle, faith, suffering, and Dostoevsky's vision for humanity. At the very center of Dostoevsky's philosophical universe lies an eternal battle between faith and doubt that can never be definitively resolved through rational argument or empirical evidence, combined with his revolutionary understanding that suffering is the fundamental condition through which human beings achieve spiritual growth and authentic meaning. These twin insights form the foundation of his enduring legacy and his prophetic vision for humanity's future. This struggle is not merely an intellectual debate about the existence of God, but an existential crisis that affects every aspect of human existence. While suffering is not an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, but the crucible in which human souls are refined and transformed. Together, these insights create a philosophy that is both deeply challenging and ultimately redemptive. Dostoevsky himself embodied this struggle throughout his entire life. His arrest, imprisonment, and years in Siberia subjected his faith to the most severe possible tests while teaching him that extreme suffering could serve as a pathway to spiritual transformation. He witnessed cruelty and suffering that seemed to make a mockery of belief in a loving God, yet he also observed how those prisoners who accepted their suffering without becoming consumed by hatred often developed extraordinary capacities for kindness, wisdom, and moral insight. This experience convinced him that the deepest forms of human wisdom, compassion, and spiritual insight emerge only through profound suffering that cannot be avoided or easily resolved. The mature Dostoevsky, who emerged from this ordeal, was neither a simple believer nor a straightforward atheist, but something much more complex and interesting. A man whose faith had been tested by doubt and refined by suffering. This complex relationship between faith, doubt, and suffering is dramatized most powerfully through his greatest
Samo
characters.
pumpaj.
Ivan Karamazov represents the most sophisticated case for atheism ever presented in literature, rejecting God not on scientific grounds but on moral ones, unable to accept a universe in which innocent children suffer while God remains silent. His rebellion cannot be overcome through theological sophistication because it is based on a fundamental moral judgment about the nature of reality itself. Yet Dostoevsky shows us that Ivan's atheism leads inevitably to moral relativism and nihilistic despair, undermining the very moral foundations that would make his fight against injustice meaningful. Against Ivan stands his brother Alyosha, who chooses to trust in God's goodness despite evidence that seems to contradict it, and this choice transforms his entire relationship to existence, freeing him to respond with spontaneous love and compassion rather than intellectual paralysis. The philosophy of redemptive suffering is embodied most clearly in characters like Sonia Marmeladova, who maintains her spiritual purity despite degraded circumstances, and Father Zosima, who teaches that all human beings are responsible for the suffering of others, and that true spiritual development requires accepting this responsibility. Sonia's suffering has not made her bitter, but has deepened her capacity for love and forgiveness, allowing her to see the divine image even in a murderer like Raskolnikov. Zosima demonstrates how suffering can be transformed into spiritual wisdom, arguing that those who achieve spiritual purity through suffering become channels through which divine grace can enter the world.
Đesti bolan. Evo, ma šuti bolan, zajebam se, 15, 5, čeče, gazim sve druge tenko, nabijam je u guzicu. Neće niko da puca na njega, pa ja moram ići sa druge strane mape na ovu. Inače, kakvi smo?
Evo, došao kući, hoću pišem zadaću.
Štaš kući, bolan, kuća ima rogove.
Jebi ga, moram i ja imat
Neš valjda, najjačiji sam, ali nije dovoljno za masteri.
Redemptive suffering requires what Dostoevsky calls active love,
Znači baš.
the willingness to bear not only one's own pain, but the pain of others as well. This is not mere sympathy, but a practical commitment to sharing others' burdens, even when doing so increases one's own suffering. Such love can only emerge from those who have learned to accept their own suffering without resentment, transforming their pain into wisdom and compassion. Prince Mishkin embodies this principle through his Christ-like innocence and willingness to suffer for others, though his very goodness becomes tragically ineffective in a world unprepared to receive such unconditional love.
Joj, ništa, došao malo da mene pozdraviš, ideš pisati zadaću.
Pa došao sam da te pozdravim da pišem zadaću usput.
Svaka čast.
Ti imaš V8?
A? Imam.
Što ne vičeš da imaš V8?
Imam V8. Šta je V8?
Ma imaš to, ja da.
Da, imam. Što? Vidiš kako sam dobar tim dobio.
Writing decades before the rise of totalitarian movements, he predicted with astonishing accuracy how revolutionary ideologies would evolve into systems of mass oppression and psychological control. The Grand Inquisitor's vision of a society based on bread, miracle and authority perfectly anticipated the appeal of fascist and communist regimes that would seduce millions with promises of security and relief from the burden of freedom. His novels demonstrated how intellectual sophistication and humanitarian ideals could be corrupted into justifications for terrorism and mass murder, showing that the greatest evils would come from educated idealists who believed they were serving humanity. These political prophecies remain essential for understanding contemporary threats to human freedom and dignity. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights have proven equally prophetic and enduring. His exploration of the unconscious mind, the divided self, and the complex motivations that drive human behavior anticipated major psychological discoveries by decades. His understanding of how excessive self-consciousness can paralyze effective action perfectly describes the condition of millions of modern people
Najjače mi je kada dođu ovi lightovi njihovi na stranu od heavy-a.
His analysis of how childhood trauma, social alienation and spiritual emptiness create psychological disorders remains more penetrating than most contemporary theories. Most importantly, his insight that psychological healing requires spiritual transformation rather than merely technical intervention offers hope for those whom secular psychology has failed to help. The spiritual dimensions of Dostoevsky's work have become even more relevant, as modern secular culture has failed to provide the meaning and transcendent significance that human beings need. His prediction that the loss of religious faith would lead to nihilism and moral relativism has been confirmed by societies that have attempted to build purely secular forms of meaning. His understanding that human beings cannot live without transcendent purpose helps explain why secular ideologies so often function as substitutes for
kad završiš zadaću pa dođi slobodno, nemoj stid.
absolute loyalty.
Doći igrat ćemo nešto valjda.
His vision of faith as an existential choice rather than an intellectual conclusion provides a way of maintaining religious commitment even in the face of modern criticism and scientific skepticism. Faith, for Dostoevsky, is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning despite evidence that seems to contradict it. Perhaps most importantly, Dostoevsky's legacy lies in his unflinching honesty about the complexity and difficulty of human existence, combined with his ultimate hope for human transformation. He refused to offer easy solutions or comfortable reassurances, acknowledging the strongest arguments against his own positions through characters as intelligent and sympathetic as those who represent his preferred alternatives. He recognized that the choice between faith and doubt, freedom and security, love and power cannot be resolved through rational argument alone, but requires fundamental decisions about how to interpret life's ambiguous evidence. This intellectual honesty makes his ultimate affirmations more meaningful because they emerge from genuine struggle with doubt and despair rather than naive optimism. Dostoevsky's vision for humanity is both deeply pessimistic and ultimately hopeful. He recognized that human beings are capable of extraordinary evil and that social progress does not automatically lead to moral improvement. He understood that the loss of traditional sources of meaning would create psychological crises that could not be easily resolved through rational analysis or social reform. He predicted that attempts to create perfect societies through human effort alone would inevitably lead to tyranny and the destruction of everything that makes life worth living. Yet he also believed that humans are capable of transcending their limitations through spiritual transformation and redemptive love, achieving levels of wisdom and compassion that approach the divine. He demonstrated through his greatest characters that even the most degraded individuals can be redeemed through genuine repentance and acceptance of grace. The choice that Dostoevsky presents to humanity remains as relevant today as it was in 19th century Russia. We can choose the path of the Grand Inquisitor, seeking security and relief from freedom's burden, even at the cost of our humanity. We can choose Ivan Karamazov's path, demanding that reality conform to our moral expectations and rejecting any universe that fails.
Texas 93.
We can choose
Je platio svojom glavučom.
retreating into bitter isolation as a way of asserting
Da da li će me rastočiti ovaj
apparently meaningless world.
ili neće.
Or we can choose the path of Christ as Dostoevsky understood it, accepting the burden of freedom and responsibility while trusting in the possibility of redemption through love. This choice must be renewed constantly throughout our lives and will determine not only our own fate, but the fate of human civilization itself.
Okay. 15.3. Strašno, napravili su lošina, dva lajta njihova su napravili grešku i to je dovelo do pada.
Dostoevsky's insights are more essential than ever. His warnings about utopian thinking speak directly to contemporary movements that promise to solve all problems through correct theories and techniques. His understanding of psychological manipulation anticipates sophisticated forms of propaganda that characterize modern mass societies. His analysis of how spiritual emptiness leads to despair helps explain epidemics of depression and suicide that plague even prosperous societies. His vision of love as ultimate reality offers the only realistic hope for overcoming the hatred and division that threaten human civilization. The final message of Dostoevsky's philosophical legacy is both challenging and encouraging. Challenging because it demands that we abandon comfortable illusions about human nature and face existence's full complexity. Challenging because it requires taking responsibility for our choices without the security of absolute certainty about what is right. Challenging because it calls us to love when love is not returned, forgive when forgiveness is not deserved, and hope when hope seems impossible. But encouraging because it demonstrates that humans can rise above their limitations to achieve consciousness and moral development that justify existence's suffering and struggle. Encouraging because it shows that even the darkest circumstances cannot completely extinguish human dignity and the possibility of redemption. Encouraging because it proves that love, truth and spiritual reality are stronger than hatred, deception and material force, even when their victory is not immediately visible. Dostoevsky's philosophy offers no easy answers, but provides something far more valuable: a vision of what human beings can become when they choose to embrace rather than flee from their condition's full reality. It shows that life's meaning is found not in the absence of suffering, but in suffering's transformation into love. It demonstrates that freedom is not the elimination of constraints, but the conscious choice to serve something greater than ourselves. It proves that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning, despite contradictory evidence. These insights remain as revolutionary today as when Dostoevsky first articulated them, continuing to offer hope and guidance for anyone seeking authentic existence in a world often hostile to such aspirations. The mind of Fyodor Dostoevsky contained wisdom that humanity is still learning to understand and apply. His legacy challenges us to face reality without illusion while maintaining hope without naivety, to love without conditions while accepting responsibility without excuses, to choose freedom while bearing its full weight and cost. This is perhaps the most difficult path humans can walk, but it is also the only path that leads to genuine fulfillment and authentic meaning. Those who choose this path join a communion of souls that transcends time and circumstance, united by their commitment to truth, love, and the endless struggle to become more fully human. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate gift. Not a philosophical system or easy answers, but a vision of what we can become when we choose to live with courage, honesty, and love in the face of life's eternal mysteries.
You've been giving away your power all your life, and you didn't even realize it. Each time you responded to somebody who wasn't worthy, every stupid time you tried to explain yourself to people who were never going to get it, all that time you wasted your energy on the wrong people. You gave them a piece of yourself, a piece of your power, a piece of your peace, and they took it. But today that ends. I'm going to tell you 7 dark psychology tricks that even Machiavelli would have perfected. Tricks that will show you how to dominate without conflict, win without a fight, and become untouchable by deciding when and where your presence is known and shown. You see, most people run on autopilot. Someone insults them, they react. Someone questions them, they explain. They're drained of their vitality, they give it away. They believe they're showing strength to make this conversation happen. They figure they're being clever by defending themselves, and they're wrong. The true power brokers, they play a different game. They don't react, they don't explain. They don't spend a single second on people who are not important. They hoard their attention like it's the most valuable asset on earth, because it is. Think about it. Every billionaire, every strongman, every truly untouchable person shares one trait. They're selective. They don't respond to everyone. They don't show up everywhere. They do not expend their energy out of generosity, and that's precisely what makes them magnetic. Machiavelli knew this, realized this 500 years ago. He learned that power is not about volume. It's not about showing the world everyone who doubts you. Power is quiet. Power is selective. Power is strategic. You're also going to learn how to use it. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to unpack 7 lessons that will fundamentally change how you approach life. You'll discover how to get people obsessed with you by saying nothing. You'll find out how silence is more harmful than any comeback you could ever have. You'll know how to pull back in a way so people are chasing you, not the other way around. This isn't about being cold. This isn't about being cruel. This is your life, taking control of it back. This is about coming from a place of power rather than reaction. This is about being the person that no one can manipulate, no one can control, and no one can ignore. Now I want you to drop that affirmation in the comments. I control my power. Let's begin. 1. Protect your attention as if it's gold. This gets us back to one of the most basic rules of power. Your attention is currency, and like money, the minute you're just throwing it around, you are out. Here's what nobody tells you. Literally every time you lend somebody your attention, it's an investment. You're spending all of your mental energy, your emotional bandwidth, your time on that person or situation. And just like any investment, you have to ask yourself, what am I getting back? Most people never ask that question. They pander to whomever demands their attention. A hater comments, they clap back. A toxic person kicks up drama, they engage. Someone disrespects them. The next 3 hours are spent concocting the perfect comeback. And what do they get back? Nothing. Nothing but stress, frustration, and lost time. Machiavelli got something that almost no one else did yet. The one who directs where they place their attention directs their whole life. Because attention is not only focus, it's power. Every time you give someone your attention, you're giving them power over your emotions, your thoughts, and what you do with your energy. Consider the people who suck your cup dry, the complainers, the needy ones, the critics who love to point out everything you have done wrong. And now, ask yourself what they've ever done for you in exchange for all that attention. They've been good for you, haven't they? Have they helped you grow? Have they contributed anything of substance? The answer is probably no, but somehow they keep getting your attention. Why? And that's because you have never learned how to be discerning. Here's what the biggies do. They create a filter. Not everyone gets access. Not everyone gets a response. Not everyone gets their time. Before even bothering to pay any attention to anyone, they ask one simple question. Does this person deserve it? And if the answer is no, they walk away. No reason, no rationale, no turning back. This is the point where most persons screw up. They believe that they owe the kindness of attention to everyone. They feel like they have to answer every message, answer every comment, entertaining all attempts to bring them into drama. They believe that ignoring people is an indulgence of rudeness or weakness. But it's the complete opposite. You're not a weak person if you ignore the undeserving. It makes you untouchable. It sends the message that you respect yourself enough to guard your energy. It shows that you are not just available to anyone who wants a slice of you. Say someone sends you a rude message. Your first reaction is likely to be to retaliate, to stand up for yourself, to take them down a peg or two. But what does that accomplish? Congratulations, you've done exactly what they wanted you to do. Your response, your vibe, your force. Now imagine you do nothing at all. You read it, erupt with nothing, and delete it. What happens to that person? They sit there and wonder why you didn't do something. They see if you read it. And they may even send another message attempting to grab your attention. And you're never bothered the entire time living your life. That is the easy magic of guarded attention. You become a castle that no one can enter unless you lower the bridge. And you open that gate only for people who deserve it. And then on from here, you need to treasure your attention as the gold that it is. And gold is not for everybody. It goes to the worthy. Post this affirmation in the comments. My attention is gold. Secondly, silence is your greatest weapon. Do you know what people are afraid of when they're scared of silence? Since they think the story makes them look weak. They feel that if they don't get their own back, if they don't defend themselves, and if they're not the ones who have the last word, then somehow they've been beaten. To them, silence is submission. But here is the truth that should change everything. The most power you can assert is to say nothing at all. Think about it. When you are assailed in words and then respond with yet more words, what will be the outcome? You've entered their game, you're playing by their rules. They got what they wanted, a reaction from you, and now you're caught in a never-ending cycle of back and forth that serves no one. But when you answer with silence, it's a whole different ballgame. The game stops, the power shifts, and all of a sudden, they're the ones standing there looking stupid, talking to a wall, getting nada squared from you. Machiavelli knew this. He'd seen so many men wreck themselves by talking too much, explaining too much, reacting too much. And he observed that it was the people who ascended to power who knew when to talk and when not to talk. And there is something any language never can convey, and that's silence. Complete indifference. It says, I am not going to waste my words. You're not worth my energy. You're not even a blip on my radar. And that's ultimately what destroys individuals more than any insult ever could. Let me explain why silence is such a powerhouse. When you reply to someone, you're confirming them, because what they said must have meant enough to you that you chose to respond. You're letting them know they got to you, that they affected you, that they won. But when you don't say anything, you deny them that validation. They're just left in a vacuum of not knowing. Did you see their message? Did it bother you? Do you even care? They'll never know. And that won't sit well with them any more than being outwitted in a comeback would. I've seen people waste days, if not weeks, wondering why the other person never called or didn't receive their email. They replay the conversation in their mind. They ask themselves what they should have done differently. They think whole other scenarios up about what happened, all because of silence. That's psychological warfare without a single shot having to be fired. Here's something else most people don't know. The more you speak, the more you present your enemies with ammunition. All of your words are information. Each defense you suggest is a liability they can make use of. Each